So I've compiled 100 tips for TFT, and this is going to encompass everything. I have trait tips, I have champion tips, beginner, intermediate, advanced, and augment tips as well. Let's just get right into it, but I will say that no matter your level, if you're new to the game, if you're more advanced, I guarantee you there'll be some of these here that you didn't actually know. We're gonna start with the beginner tips, then the trait tips, then the intermediate, then the champions, then the augments, then the advanced tips. So the first tip I have is, you may have noticed that a lot of people are leaving this little orb on their board and not picking it up. The reason why people don't pick it up is because it takes a unit out of the champion pool, whereas when it remains in the orb, the unit can still be seen in the shop. So what that means is, by not taking that orb, you actually increase your shop odds for getting a specific champion. In this game here, I waited until I saw 8 Zeds before picking up that Zed orb in order to get my 9th Zed. This made it a lot easier to get him when I was rolling down. Next, let's talk about slamming items. And this is specific for set 8. Slamming items early is much more important this set than previous sets because of the item anvils that come out later on in the game. The item anvils make it so that you can kind of craft perfect items for whichever unit you want, so getting the immediate power spike early on is worth much more in set 8. The next tip is another item tip. If you have 4 or more item components, build an item. Whenever I watch people play in lower ratings, especially when I'm coaching, I see the enemy players and they have like 10 item components on their bench. You have to use those items because what else are you waiting for in the game? Health is a very important resource in TFT, and one way to save health is by building items. After that, I want you to focus on building a mix of damage and tank items. Too often I see people building 6 damage items or 6 tank items, and that's going to be too much for your team. Just because the game isn't balanced doesn't mean your items shouldn't be as well. Sometimes in our TFT games, we get consumables such as item remover and reforgers. These drops are random, and there's a chance to get them off of orbs that you get from the neutral camps. So as much as you want to use these super optimally, don't sweat too much about these consumable items. These items are purely bonuses for you, and you didn't receive them in lieu of something else that game. Next, let's talk about the very start of the game. So on the very first carousel, always follow through into your second choice just in case you miss your first one. This is especially important if a couple of people are fighting for the same exact item as you. Always have a secondary option in mind and always follow through and walk past the item into your next one. Let's talk about the early game now. If you won all of your stage 2 fights, level up to level 6 on stage 3-1 in order to preserve your win streak. If you're actually lose streaking and you lost your first 4 fights on stage 2, you'll actually want to make sure that you guarantee lose your 5th match. Sometimes that means benching your strongest units or your item holders as well, just to guarantee the lose streak gold. Scouting is important when doing this, so the best advice I can give you is check on the right hand side of your screen. You can see that there are swords next to some of your next potential opponents. You can only face people who have those swords in the next round. So always scout those people and make sure that you can actually lose or beat them depending on which one you want. Next, I want to talk about augments. In set 8, they introduced what's called a hero augment. Hero augments all appear for players at the same time, so don't feel cheated whenever you see them. There's not going to be a case where you get a 1-cost augment and your opponents get a 5-cost augment. Everyone gets relatively the same power, and it's going to happen at the same time. Another important thing to do in the early game is to check the weather. And no, I don't mean outside because we don't go outside because we're playing TFT. Janna is a premier late game splash unit, but it's important to know if her bonus is useful to you. It can either be sunny, which gives the units around her a shield, rainy, which gives mana, or windy, which gives AD and AP. Always check this little icon on the bottom right to check the weather. Next, I want to talk about how mana works. There are 2 ways to gain mana. You can either gain mana on every auto attack, which is 10 mana per auto. You also gain mana when you take damage. The calculation's a little bit difficult. You gain mana based on 1% of pre-mitigation damage and 7% of post-mitigation damage. What this means is, squishier champions tend to gain more mana from taking damage, but you run the risk of the unit dying earlier. To sum it all up, you just gain mana when you take damage. Another weird little mechanic that a lot of people know about is how much stronger is a 2-star champion compared to a 1-star? What about a 3-star champion compared to a 1-star? Well, it's actually a very simple equation. 2-star champions are precisely 1.8 times the stats of a 1-star champion, and 3-star champions are 1.8 times the strength of a 2-star champion. So if you compare a 3-star to a 1-star, that's going to be 3.24 times the amount of stats. In order to get a 3-star champion, you need to think a lot about your gold. Just like in real life, gold is more valuable in the early game than in the late game. Don't be afraid to spend your gold in the late game and forego interest, and in the early game, do everything you can to save money. Remember how Warren Buffett said compounding interest is the 8th wonder of the world? Well, it does apply to TFT in some ways as well. Another tip about gold is that just like how Doublelift can't save his flash for next worlds, you can't save your gold for your next game. So if you are low and you're about to die, you should try to spend your gold instead of saving it. Next, I want to talk about data. Did you know that the highest average placement items are Shroud of Stillness and Zephyr? Does that mean that they are the best 2 items in the game? Probably not, but they are very strong because people in the late game typically take them off of Carousel and get a huge advantage from it. That doesn't mean you should build them in the early game though. Lastly, don't let data dictate the way you play. TFT has a large amount of skill expression and data doesn't exactly show that. Also, there is such a thing as good data and bad data. More on this in a future video. Another important thing to remember is that TFT is a game of variance. The players who climb the most are the ones who manage this variance the best. Even if you have an unlucky game, you should always think about whether you could have gotten a 7th instead of an 8th. And also keep in mind that sometimes bad games do happen and there isn't often that much you can do about it. But if you aren't the very highest rank, there's always something that you could have improved instead. Speaking of higher rated players, sometimes copying them is easier than discovering. It isn't exactly shameful to copy either because not everyone has unlimited time to fully test out every team composition in the game. A lot of the top players also copy everyone else as well. That's why I like to use bunnymuffins.lol/meta to get the best tier list in TFT that's updated every single Friday. Another important thing to read is reading the patch notes. Reading those notes and preparing for future patches using that info is crucial if you want to get better at the game. Even if you don't actually sit down to think about the changes, just knowing that the changes happened will influence your play subconsciously. You can also follow along my patch rundowns that I do every single time a new patch comes out, and that's typically going to be every 2 weeks on a Tuesday. Speaking of knowing things, did you know that there was a champion pool? Each unit tier has a set amount of champions in that pool, which means that there are only so many copies of each champion in the game. However, champion duplicators can still duplicate champions even if there are no copies of that champion left in the pool. The last beginner tip is whenever you level up and you don't really know what to put in, try putting in a threat unit. These units aren't trait based, so they work in every single comp. Next, I have 15 trait tips that I want to share with you. These are all going to be related to the new set, as the entire set has all new traits. The first one we're going to talk about is Defenders. Defenders taunt enemies at the start of combat, so make sure when you itemize for tank items, try to prioritize the ones that take advantage of that targeting, such as Gargoyle Stoneplate or Dragonclaw, which gain a larger benefit when they're hit by more people. Next is a tip about threat units and Built Different. In case you didn't know, Built Different does not work on threat units. However, that doesn't mean that threat units are bad in a Built Different comp. Think about it for a moment. You can run threats in all sorts of different compositions which revolve around a trait. So why does that make Built Different any different? It doesn't. Essentially, if you need that threat unit to either splash in temporarily or because it counters a lobby, it's still going to be useful in a Built Different comp. Another threat tip is that each threat does its own thing. You need to be scouting the lobby to figure out whether you need to use each unit or not. For example, if your opponents are using a lot of attack damage comps, maybe use Rammus, and conversely, maybe use Cho'Gath if you're facing a lot of magic damage. On to Mecha Primes, one mistake that I see people using is accidentally putting units on other Mecha Prime units that get absorbed. Definitely don't do this because you do not get the benefits of other items. There's no way I actually was trolling that hard. Why didn't anyone say anything last round? Onto supers. Supers are great for reroll, but of course make sure to actually use their secondary traits to make your reroll comps even stronger. Don't just blindly use supers in a reroll comp just because you can get them to 3-star. Fiddlesticks is an odd unit. His trait is Corrupted, and the way this works is that he only comes to life at 60% health or when your entire team is dead. Normally, you don't want him coming up when your entire team is dead because he'd be much more useful when your entire team is alive. That means you should probably put Fiddlesticks near the front where he can actually take damage to activate his trait. The next tip is a common beginner mistake that I often see, and that is when going for a higher tier of a damage trait, make sure that the units are actually either useful or itemized. When I say useful, that means having some sort of utility for your team. If going into a higher tier of a damage trait just means adding more damage units, well, damage units without items are almost useless. For example, in 4 aces, most of the units just do damage, so be sure to really utilize the 4 ace bonus if you are indeed running that, because at least 2 of your units are most likely going to be completely useless. Next, Just because the trait name is the same as in previous sets doesn't mean that it does the same thing. For example, brawlers used to give your entire team health and gave themselves bonus health on top of that. In set 8, they just give it to themselves now. I want to talk about spell slingers now. Unlike other spellcaster traits of the past, such as mage or sorcerer, spell slingers shoot an orb every 5 seconds. This means that things like mana regeneration don't do that much for the trait, and really only ability power helps enhance that. However, this does not mean that mana regeneration is completely useless for those units, because sometimes you still want them to cast a little bit earlier. Recons gain critical strike chance. Having the recon trait active gives your recon units extra critical strike chance. Remember how assassins use Infinity Edge really well? Well, assassins are gone now, but we could put IE and JG on recons now instead. The next 2 tips deal with stacking. So first I want to talk about renegades. The last renegade standing gets a big bonus. So items like Archangel Staff are going to empower them a ton because they'll be able to get a lot of stacks and gain the benefit of the renegade trait when they're the last one standing. Sure shots are pretty similar. Sure shots scale as the fight goes on. They essentially have the built-in Archangel Staff, except it gives attack damage. This means whenever you play a sure shot build, you don't really need to build that much damage and should focus more on tanks to stall out the fights to get those stacks going. This next step is a little simpler. Did you accidentally place your gadgetine item on the wrong unit? Well, gadgetine items can be removed by placing your unit on the bench. Feel free to quickly swap in and out units just to get the item on the right person. Now for something more creative, Hacker can be used in many different ways. It's essentially a way to bypass people's tanks. However, it goes beyond that. Sometimes you could teleport a CC unit to the back to permanently shut down the enemy carry. As a general trait tip, there are a ton of counter traits and champions in this set. In the late game, it may be better to fit in an extra Aegis against AP comps instead of a random legendary unit, or even a unit that's relevant for your team comp. You could even try using a threat counter if you can't find a specific synergy to counter your opponent. I suspect splash units to be very creative in this set, especially in those 1v1 scenarios at the end of the game. Now let's move on to the intermediate tips. I have 7 of them for you, and the last 2 that I'm going to mention are a little bit counterintuitive, especially as a YouTuber. The first tip is, if your tank sucks, no tank items will save him. Just build a ZZ Rot portal on them instead. This is especially useful if you have a low-cost, non-high-starred tank, such as a 2-star Annie. No amount of tank items are going to make her that much tankier in the late game, so if you need tankiness from her, just build ZZ Rot portals. Now at the start of the game, before it even begins, before you even turn on your computer and start playing TFT, you should have an idea of what items you want and which comps are good with those starting items. This helps you manage your early game a lot better, and it also reduces the chance of getting those really bad starts in the early game. I want to talk about rolling next. If you have 4 or more pairs, you definitely should be rolling, at least around 10 gold until you star up some of those pairs. You know how whenever you watch some streamers say, let me roll a bit, and then they pretty much hit stuff every single time? It's because they know when to roll, and they generally roll when they do have pairs, and you could also do this outside of those leveling and rolling guidelines. Speaking of leveling guides, when looking at a leveling guide, don't forget that pre-leveling is also an option to get improved shop odds for 1 turn. Do this if you're not going to lose any interest. A common mechanic that a lot of players don't know about is the fact that debuffs do not stack. Instead, in TFT, units just take the highest form of that debuff. For example, if 2 debuffs hits the same unit, one is a 75% armor penetration and another one's 25%, it only takes a 75 armor penetration debuff. Now comes the weird parts. You don't actually have to use your low-cost hero or silver augments throughout the entire game. Sometimes continuing to use them can be detrimental to your team. These silver augments or the low-cost hero augments are really just there to get you through the early game or just give you a tiny bit of help here and there. And sometimes making the best of a bad situation is just not using them at all. The last intermediate tip I have for you is don't just play a comp because a tier list says to do so. Know why certain traits work well together. For example, Star Guardians gain bonus mana when they gain mana, and civilians give mana as well. Maybe that synergy makes those 2 traits work together pretty well. However, knowing about it and not knowing about it means that you can actually make an informed decision whenever you have to sub traits in and out. Now for the champion tips. Alistair has a single target CC and heal, and this means that positioning him doesn't change the number of target he hits. However, it does mean that you should decide who you should target. Annie is a tank, but a 2-cost tank, and she's the only one that's a spell slinger or a gadgetine. This means you need to treat her as such and build ZZ Rot portals on her instead of actual tank items if you intend to keep her into the late game, especially if she's just a 2-star. Aphelios can change his ability by placing him on the bench and back onto the board, similar to how we can remove and replace gadgetine items. Choose the ability that your team is most lacking. I will say though that if he doesn't have any items and isn't upgraded, obviously the stun ability should be the best. Ashe gets attack damage from her ability, critical strike from recon, and laser core benefits from attacking or getting hit by an attack. Guess which stat is the best to build on her then? Obviously attack speed, because she already gets all the other stats from her trait and ability, and laser core benefits from attacking more. Next up we have Aurelion Sol. Ace Sol is one of those examples where you really need to read the champion abilities. He applies a % health burn that reduces healing, so obviously don't build Morello on him. Also don't run Sunfire board. You probably don't want to have Sunfire on your front line either. Instead, build mana items on him so that he ramps up and casts earlier and more often. Bel'Veth has a built-in Rage Blade, so you don't really need to build attack speed on her. We'll get more into this when we go over the advanced tips, where I talk about how you don't want to go all in on one stat and you actually want to mix and match stats instead, similar to what we did with Ashe. So since Bel'Veth has built-in attack speed, focus more on damage, critical strike, and damage amplification. Also keep in mind that she has 20 mana, so you probably don't want too many tier items on her. The next champion's a weird one, and that is Blitzcrank. So while he may not have a hook built into his ability, he can actually get his hook ability from an augment. People can also get Rocket Grab from Ornn, so always be sure to scout, because forgetting about Blitzcrank hook or Rocket Grab can easily cost you 20 health because your carry got hooked into the enemy team. Camille is a great splash unit because she can disarm people in the front lines. In set 8, we have a ton of melee carries, so be sure that she's placed in front of them instead of just in front of a tank. If you need to have an anti-mage but don't feel like building Shroud of Stillness, Cho'Gath gives both MR and Mana Reave. Just be sure to position him in a way that he hits who you need. Draven is a classic example of a range carry that is very tanky if you have the Mecha Prime trait active. I predict that we'll likely be using him in the front line similar to how Dragonmancers were used last set, so be sure to have some form of lifesteal on him if he is indeed your mecha. Galio only shields his closest ally. This means that Galio is great in a 2-tank composition or with a melee carry. Just be sure to place Galio next to your main tank or the carry that you'd like to get the shield on. Gangplank is a melee carry, and there are actually a ton of melee carries this set, which means that they probably want things like Quicksilver, right? Well, actually, Gangplank sheds crowd control effects with his ability, so it's actually a bit redundant on him. Janna is a great unit, but she has pretty awful AP scaling. She really only cares about mana regeneration, so don't go spamming AP items on her if you have a different unit that can benefit from it instead. Jax is a stacking champion, but he's also melee, which means it's hard for him to survive. That's why he's really only viable as a carry in a Mecha Prime build if you itemize for sustains such as Bloodthirster, Edge of Night, or Titan's Resolve. Jinx is normally a damage carry in TFT, but this set she has great CC, which means she's probably going to be good as a synergy bot. She could also make better use of mana items more so than damage items in most cases. Kai'Sa is one of those weird champions that is attack speed focus along with ability power. This is a really odd combination and usually does not pan out well, which means she'll probably be the forgotten unit of the set unless Riot overbuffs her. Remember Zeri from last set? Well yeah, she was there, but you probably barely used her. This typically happens to champions with odd scaling and no utility outside of pure damage. LeBlanc is a reset champion. Whenever this exists, you really need to have your team focus in on one target. This means you should put all your damage dealers on the same side as LeBlanc so they all hit the same unit. Lee Sin shields himself and his nearest ally. This is very similar to Galio. You'll want to place him next to your main tank or next to your melee carry that you want to protect. Lulu purely does damage and is a 1-cost unit, so that means in the late game, at best, she can be a trait bot. At worst, she's a wasted slot on her team. My prediction is Lulu will probably only really be used as an item holder in this set because she's pretty much useless in the late game. Unlike the other 1-cost this set, Lux actually does have some utility in her kit. She lowers her target's attack damage by 40% for 4 seconds, which is great against melee carries. The only downside about Lux is that her targeting is random. Malphite has built-in armor from his ability, and this means you should itemize for health to get more effective HP. Misfortune's ability does not go through her target, which means that Oxforce units are a great counter to her because they become invulnerable. Are you in the late game and need magic resist piercing? Well, Mordekaiser has that built in, and he's also a great late game unit in general. Nasus is great at reducing the effectiveness of melee carries, so make sure to position for that. If you're lazy, put him on the side in the front line because people normally put their melee carries around there. The best positioning for Nyla would be around your other tanks. This means she is great in multi-tank comps. This also means that solo tank items such as Stoneplate and Dragonclaw aren't as good for your team when you play Nyla. Nunu has built-in scaling, which means you just really need him to live. A mix of tank items and damage items should do just that. Sometimes full damage Nunu will just die before he reaches his maximum potential. In the early game, Poppy is one of the worst units to have if you're trying to lose gracefully. Essentially, if you're trying to lose streak while not losing too much health, Poppy is a pretty bad unit to play. This is because Poppy targets the furthest enemy. Since assassins do not exist in this set, this means that it's really hard for your team to kill those backline carries that Poppy throws her shields at. Whenever you're lose streaking, you're really just trying to kill 1 or 2 units, and Poppy just doesn't help you do that at all. Rammus is actually great for the lazy players out there because you don't actually need to pay attention to positioning him. He always launches himself at the largest group of nearby enemies, so as long as he's somewhat in the ballpark, his ability should hit good units no matter what. Rel is a decent tank, but she's mainly used for her ability. Try to give her items that give her the most resistances because that's how her ability scales. For example, opt for a Bramble Vest instead of a Sunfire Cape because Bramble Vest gives bonus armor. While Renekton seems super fun, at the end of the day, he's a 1-cost unit. Unless you have the carry augment for him, leave him as an item holder or a trait bot. While it may not look like it, Riven is the Nunu of set 8. If she has more health than her target, she deals more damage. That means that Warmogs and similar health items are obviously preferred on her. There might even be a Mecha Prime Riven build that's just waiting to be discovered. Samira is an AoE AD champion, which is quite rare. This means that you need to build your team a little bit differently compared to other AD carries. Things like Sunfire Board synergizes really well with AoE teams because it prevents the AoE units from healing back up. Conversely, Sunfire Board's pretty bad in single target compositions. Sejuani targets the closest enemy with an AoE stun. Normally, you would place your main tanks front and center, but Sejuani is a little bit different. You'll normally want to place her near the sides to hit their carries. Senna's ability is a little odd. It's multi-target, but targets a nearby enemy. You will need to place her in a way that hits multiple people, but this really depends on what your opponent is doing. Feel free to experiment with her positioning by moving her up or back a few hexes. Soraka takes time to charge up. This means you'll likely always want an Archangel staff on her because her first casts are going to pretty much do nothing anyways. Syndra is essentially the old legendary Thresh. She scales horribly with AP, so really just focus on mana regeneration items with her. She really just needs to cast a lot and get units off your bench. She is probably the best super late game unit. Unfortunately, the super late game is a little more difficult to reach because they increase player damage. Talon always targets the unit furthest away from the center of the board. This means you'll want to move your carry away from the corner to avoid being targeted if there's a lot of Talon players. This requires a bit of scouting. Either place a bait unit in the corner or place your carry in the center in the back. Urgot doesn't really care that much about his items other than mana. He has decent range, he does max health damage, and his CC ability gives you loot. Prioritize mana on him over damage. Just because Vayne has mana doesn't mean that she doesn't like Rageblade. In previous sets, her ability gave her true damage every 3 auto attacks. Now it's every 4 auto attacks since she has 40 mana. Always think of mana in terms of the number of attacks you need to put out. If you need armor penetration and you couldn't build a Last Whisper because you're a last pick on every carousel, don't forget about Vi. You could always place her in just to give that much needed armor penetration for your team. Wukong is a great solo tank in the early game because he gets a larger bonus per enemy hit. That means he is a great item holder for things like Gargoyle Stoneplate and Dragonclaw. For Yasuo, he dashes to find units in a line. Oftentimes that means he will be closer to enemies. Don't use stuff like rapid fire cannon or scope weapons on him because it just really doesn't do as much on him compared to other champions. I didn't think I need to mention this, but I've seen several people do this already, so I'm guessing that some people didn't realize that. Zac is one of those rare cases where you only really want to build one type of stat on him, and that is health. The reason why you want to do this is because he splits into different blobs and they really only benefit from his max HP. Lastly, Zoe is great at targeting different units, so it only makes sense that Morello is probably one of the most viable things to build on her. Now onto the augments. I really only have 4 augment tips for you because they didn't change any of the augments for the new set. First one is Celestial Blessing versus Thrill of the Hunt. It's an age-old question. I was planning to make a video on this long ago, but I didn't because I thought augments were actually going to go away. But alas, they're still here. Take Thrill of the Hunt if fights last a short amount of time, and Celestial Blessing is better in longer fights. Essentially, if your team likes items like Archangel Staff or Ascension, Celestial would be better for your team because you rely more on scaling. There are a ton of ways to influence your augments. The first way is to have active traits before the 3-2 and 4-2 augment stages. This generally gives you a higher chance to get a trait-related augment. A second way to influence your augments is to have items on 3 or more different units to increase your chance for cybernetic augments, if that's a good one for your team. Lastly, before taking the AFK augment, you can adjust your board a little bit by putting in certain units that you want. You can even build items as well. After that, you can actually AFK. Now onto the 9 advanced tips for you. First one is don't overstack one stat unless a unit really benefits from that one stat. We have talked about this before, but to give a few more examples, don't stack attack speed on duelists because they naturally get attack speed from their trait. Instead, focus on things like attack damage, critical strike, and damage amplification. Obviously, there are exceptions to these rules, such as for on-hit builds or HP on Zac. If you guys are interested, I could show you the math on this for both damage and tank stats, so let me know down in the comments if you want me to make a video on that. The next tip is always prepare for taking Think Fast before an augment round. This is something you see a lot of higher level players do. They don't just sit around when the fights are playing out. They're always thinking of different ways to improve their board or preparing for things such as the Think Fast augment. Speaking of augments, sometimes giving up on an augment is the best thing to do. One thing I've noticed already is that a lot of high level players don't actually use the champion augment they get every single game. Sometimes forgoing it to go for a different comp or champion carry benefits your team much more. Speaking of high level players, if you're trying to get a lot better, sometimes it's better to watch than to play. This could be either your own games or other people's games. Expanding a bit more on a previous tip, during fights, don't just watch for fun. Always think about what you'll be doing in your next turns. If you have nothing to think about, look at the positioning of each of your champions in each fight and think about how to change it based on the interactions you see play out on your board. At the very minimum, at least plan out the next time you're going to roll or level up. This next tip's a little controversial. It's trust but verify. Sometimes top players or developers say that a certain interaction is fixed or a bug is fixed here and there, and oftentimes I found that it actually is not, even after they say it's fixed. Obviously, most of the time you should trust them, but always verify yourself. A lot of people don't know about how items work in TFT, such as the item pools that you get, but another thing that people don't know is that during stage 2 and stage 4 carousels, these two carousels will always have one of every component, whereas stage 3 has more variations. That's why sometimes when you're first pick on stage 3, you don't always get the item you want, but if it's on stage 2 or 4, you at least have a shot of getting one of those. The next tip is what's considered best in slot might not actually be best in slot in your game. So oftentimes when you're looking at guides, you see like, oh, like this unit likes this comp likes that. And that's true in a lot of different cases, but each game's different because you're facing different opponents, you have different augments, and you have different roles. Always think about what's best in slot in your current game, not what's considered best in slot in general. The last tip is actually a very important tip, and a lot of people don't really realize this. A lot of players are very lazy with positioning, myself included. So the best way to counteract this and avoid getting scouted and positioned around is just swap your units around randomly right at the end of the round. A lot of top level players do this when they don't have time to scout, and it just ensures that people who are scouting you are really just getting 50-50s. So there you have it. If you guys didn't notice yet, I actually gave you guys 101 tips instead of just 100, so you did get a bonus right there. But hopefully these tips will help you either improve as a player or give you a bit more knowledge on the game. Let me know down below what your favorite tip was, and let me know if some tips you have of your own that should be shared with other players as well. You can do that on my Discord at discord.gg/bunnymuffins, or just leave it down in the comments below. We went over a lot of stuff today, so I'll just keep this outro quick. So I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you all next time.